Before sunrise on June 15, 2006, a Boeing 737 cargo aircraft departed Belgium on what appeared to be an ordinary overnight flight to London. There were no passengers on board, no warning signs, and no indication that this routine journey would later become the subject of a major aviation investigation. The aircraft would not suffer a catastrophic mechanical failure, and there would be no single decision that could explain what happened. Instead, investigators would discover how a series of ordinary events, each manageable on its own, gradually combined during the final minutes of flight and created a situation that tested every layer of the crew's training. The Boeing 737 was operated by two Belgian pilots experienced in overnight cargo operations. Both had reported for duty after legally compliant rest periods, although neither had achieved the quality of sleep they would have preferred before a demanding early morning flight. The captain had only recently been promoted, while the first officer was still relatively early in his airline career. They were qualified, prepared, and beginning a flight that appeared completely routine. During pre-flight planning, however, one detail required careful consideration. Forecasts indicated that visibility at their destination, London Stansted Airport, could deteriorate around the time of arrival. Rather than carry only the minimum required fuel, the captain chose to load additional reserves, giving the crew more flexibility if weather conditions changed or a diversion became necessary. At that moment, the decision appeared to be nothing more than good preparation. Extra fuel meant extra options. But as the flight progressed, that additional margin would become part of a chain of decisions that would eventually place the crew in one of the most challenging situations of their careers. The Boeing 737 climbed away from Belgium and disappeared into the darkness, beginning what everyone expected to be a normal cargo flight. But ahead of the aircraft, the weather was already changing. The Boeing 737 continued across Europe, leaving the darkness behind as the crew prepared for the arrival into London. For the moment, everything remained normal. The aircraft was operating correctly, the crew was following the plan, and the additional fuel they had loaded before departure provided valuable flexibility. But as the flight moved closer to its destination, updated weather reports confirmed the concern from earlier planning. Visibility at London Stansted was deteriorating, and conditions were becoming more challenging. The airport's instrument landing system was unavailable, meaning the crew could not use the most precise approach method normally relied upon during poor weather. The available approach required better visibility than the airport was now providing. The crew could not simply continue and attempt the landing. The approach was no longer within the required limits. With extra fuel available, the captain made the decision to delay the diversion and enter a holding pattern northwest of the airport. Fog near sunrise could sometimes improve quickly, and waiting offered the possibility that conditions might become acceptable before abandoning the original destination. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft to remain in the area, while the pilots monitored each new weather update. At first, the decision appeared reasonable. The aircraft was safe. The crew still had options. But every minute spent holding created a new problem. Each additional orbit consumed fuel while providing no guarantee that visibility would improve. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were not simply waiting for better weather. They were continuously reassessing fuel remaining, alternate airports, approach availability, and the possibility of needing to change plans. The situation was not an emergency. Nothing had failed. No warning lights had appeared. But the margin they had gained before departure was slowly being used. The longer the aircraft remained in the holding pattern, the more difficult every future decision became. And eventually, the crew would have to decide whether continuing to wait was still the safest option. With the weather at London Stansted showing no meaningful improvement, the crew reached a critical decision. Continuing to wait would only consume fuel without increasing the likelihood of a successful landing. After reviewing their remaining options and coordinating with company operations, the pilots accepted a diversion to East Midlands Airport, where a Category III instrument landing system could provide a safer approach through the extremely poor visibility. The decision solved one problem, but it introduced another. The crew was now preparing for an airport they had not originally planned to use. While the captain focused on flying the aircraft and managing the overall situation, the first officer began preparing the unfamiliar arrival procedures. Charts had to be reviewed, frequencies selected, and approach information entered into the aircraft systems. None of these tasks were unusual. But timing was critical. They were completing normal procedures during a phase of flight where workload was already increasing and the margin for error was becoming smaller. Investigators would later examine how the crew's preparation developed during the diversion, including the challenges of transitioning from a planned arrival into a new airport environment under difficult weather conditions. However, at this stage, the aircraft remained under control. The Boeing 737 was operating normally. The crew had made a logical decision based on the information available. As dawn approached, air traffic control guided the aircraft toward East Midlands, and the final approach sequence began. The latest weather reports confirmed that visibility remained extremely limited, but conditions were still within the aircraft's operational requirements. The certified auto-land system would allow the aircraft to complete the approach, even though the runway environment would remain hidden from the pilots until the final moments before touchdown. Both pilots understood the importance of the next few minutes. In dense fog, they would not be flying by visual reference. They would be relying on instruments, automation, procedures, and communication. The aircraft was stable. The systems were functioning normally. But the most critical stage of the flight was about to begin. As the Boeing 737 intercepted the ILS, both autopilots were engaged for the automatic landing. Outside the cockpit windows, dense fog completely covered the runway environment. The pilots could not see the runway ahead. Instead, they depended entirely on the aircraft's instruments, automation, and the procedures designed for these exact conditions. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft was established on the localizer. The descent path was correct. The auto-land system was guiding the Boeing 737 smoothly toward the runway. After hours of changing plans, fuel calculations, and difficult decisions, the crew had finally reached what should have been the final moments of the flight. Then, with less than 500 feet remaining, an unexpected radio transmission interrupted the approach. The tower informed the crew that company operations no longer wanted the aircraft to land and suggested a go-around at the pilot's discretion. The message was unusual. It arrived during one of the most critical phases of flight, when cockpit communication is normally limited to essential information and the crew's attention is focused entirely on maintaining the approach. The captain attempted to clarify the situation, but in the process of reaching for the radio transmit switch, he accidentally pressed the autopilot disconnect button instead. The effect was immediate. A warning tone sounded through the cockpit. The automation that had been guiding the aircraft through the fog was no longer controlling the approach. Only moments earlier, the Boeing 737 had been following a stable, fully automated landing sequence. Now, in near-zero visibility, the pilots had to transition instantly from monitoring the system to managing the aircraft themselves. The controller quickly confirmed that the aircraft was still cleared to land. But the interruption had already consumed valuable seconds. The crew began working to restore the automation while simultaneously monitoring the aircraft's changing flight path. During those moments, the Boeing 737 started moving above the glide path and drifting left of the localizer. The first officer recognized the deviation and called attention to it. But the captain's attention was divided between understanding what had happened, attempting to regain control of the approach, and keeping the aircraft stable in conditions where the runway remained invisible. Then the ground proximity warning system activated. The sound changed the situation instantly. What had been a difficult approach became an immediate emergency. The captain advanced the thrust levers and initiated a go-round, attempting to climb away from the runway environment. But the aircraft had already descended too low. Before it could safely recover, the Boeing 737 struck the ground. The impact transformed the landing attempt into a far more serious emergency than the crew initially realized. The Boeing 737 struck the ground, damaging the right main landing gear and causing structural damage to the aircraft. Warning indications appeared throughout the cockpit as the captain focused on maintaining control of the damaged aircraft. The pilots attempted to extend the landing gear manually, but there was no response. Unknown to them at the time, the right main landing gear had already separated during the impact. The aircraft was still airborne, but the situation had changed completely. The crew now had to manage a damaged aircraft, limited time, and decreasing fuel while searching for the safest possible place to land. They declared an emergency and diverted to Birmingham Airport, where conditions and emergency facilities provided the best opportunity for a controlled landing. Emergency crews positioned themselves beside the runway, prepared for the possibility of a damaged aircraft carrying fuel and cargo. Despite the structural damage and the loss of one hydraulic system, the captain successfully performed a controlled landing. The aircraft touched down on the left side of the runway, reducing the risk of losing control or leaving the paved surface. It eventually came to a stop, and emergency responders reached the aircraft within moments. Both pilots survived. The aircraft was damaged, but a potentially far worse outcome had been avoided. When investigators began examining the accident, they found that there was no single failure responsible for what happened. The aircraft itself had been operating normally. The crew had not ignored procedures. The approach had not begun as an unsafe situation. Instead, the accident developed through a combination of contributing factors: fatigue, increasing workload, communication difficulties, and a series of small deviations that became critical during the final seconds of flight. The Boeing 737 had departed Belgium before sunrise, like countless other overnight cargo flights. At the beginning of the journey, there was nothing unusual. No warning signs. No indication that the flight would become a case studied by aviation investigators. But aviation accidents are rarely created by one dramatic moment. More often, they develop slowly, when several small vulnerabilities align at exactly the wrong time. This flight became a reminder that safety is not protected only by how pilots respond when something goes wrong. It is built through every decision made before the emergency begins, through preparation, communication, discipline, and the ability to recognize when a situation is becoming more difficult than expected. Because in aviation, the most important moments are often not the ones that happen after something fails. They are the moments before, when there is still time to make the right decision.